In the years following the death of Hugo Chavez in 2013, Venezuela entered a new and more uncertain chapter under the leadership of Nicolás Maduro, a former bus driver and longtime Chavez loyalist who inherited both the presidency and a deeply fragile system. Maduro came to power through a narrow and contested election, assuming control of a country already heavily dependent on oil revenues, weakened institutions, and growing social tensions. What followed was not a sudden collapse, but a steady tightening of political control amid an accelerating economic and humanitarian crisis that would reshape Venezuelan society and silence much of its public life. As oil prices fell sharply after 2014, the economic model that had sustained the Venezuelan state unraveled. Years of mismanagement, corruption, and underinvestment had hollowed out the oil industry, leaving production in decline just as the government needed revenue most. Hyperinflation soon followed, reaching levels rarely seen outside of wartime, eroding salaries and savings almost overnight. Basic goods became scarce, and ordinary activities such as buying food or medicine turned into daily struggles. While the crisis deepened, the government blamed external forces, particularly the United States and international sanctions, framing the collapse as an economic war rather than the result of domestic policy failures. Political opposition grew as living conditions worsened. In 2015, opposition parties won a landslide victory in elections for the National Assembly, signaling widespread public discontent. Instead of accepting this shift in power, the Maduro government moved to neutralize it. The Supreme Court, filled with loyalists, stripped the legislature of its authority, effectively rendering it powerless. In 2017, the government created a new constituent assembly to bypass the opposition-controlled parliament, consolidating executive control and undermining the separation of powers that once defined Venezuela's democracy. Mass protests erupted across the country as citizens demanded elections, economic relief, and political change. These demonstrations were met with a heavy security response. Police and military forces were deployed to the streets, and hundreds of protesters were arrested. Human rights organizations documented cases of excessive force, arbitrary detention, and the intimidation of activists, journalists, and opposition figures. Independent media outlets were shut down or pressured into silence, while state-controlled media dominated the national narrative. Over time, fear replaced open dissent, and public space for criticism narrowed dramatically. Elections continued under Maduro, but their credibility was increasingly questioned. The 2018 presidential election, boycotted by much of the opposition and criticized by international observers, extended Maduro's rule but deepened Venezuela's isolation. Many countries refused to recognize the result, leading to diplomatic standoffs and competing claims to legitimacy. In 2019, opposition leader Juan Guaido declared himself interim president, citing constitutional provisions, and received recognition from several foreign governments. Inside Venezuela, however, real power remained firmly in Maduro's hands, backed by the military, security forces, and key state institutions. As political stalemate persisted, the humanitarian situation worsened. Hospitals struggled with shortages of equipment and medicine, malnutrition increased, and public services such as electricity and water became unreliable. Millions of Venezuelans left the country, seeking safety and opportunity elsewhere, creating one of the largest migration crises in the world. Families were divided, communities hollowed out, and an entire generation grew up amid uncertainty and loss. For those who remained, survival often depended on remittances, informal work, or limited state assistance tied to political loyalty. International sanctions targeted government officials and key sectors of the economy, aiming to pressure the Maduro administration into political reform. While the government denounced these measures as collective punishment, Critics argued that sanctions compounded an already devastating crisis, but did not cause it. Maduro's leadership adapted by turning inward and outward at the same time, tightening domestic control while seeking support from allies such as Russia, China, and Iran. These partnerships helped the government endure, but did little to improve daily life for most citizens. Over the years, power in Venezuela became increasingly centralized. Institutions that once served as checks on authority were weakened or dismantled, and loyalty to the ruling party became essential for advancement within the state. Civil society organizations operated under constant threat, and many voices critical of the government chose exile over silence. The promise of participatory democracy that once animated the Bolivarian project faded, replaced by a system focused on survival and control. Venezuela under Nicolás Maduro is not defined by a single moment, but by a gradual closing of political space as economic collapse and authoritarian governance reinforced one another. The nation's immense natural wealth remains largely untapped, while much of its population endures hardship and uncertainty. The silencing of dissent has not erased discontent, but it has reshaped how it is expressed, often quietly, cautiously, and beyond the country's borders. Venezuela's story under Maduro stands as a stark example of how power, when unchecked and insulated from accountability, can transform a nation's crisis into a prolonged struggle for voice, dignity, and the possibility of renewal.